I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shakin, the chair of the center, and we'd like to welcome you to the first of this semester's Bay Area Latin America Forum, which is the oldest series that the center has done, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome our speaker today, Professor Nancy Scheper-Hughes. Nancy Scheper-Hughes is the Chancellor's Professor of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. She's going to be speaking today on the revolution in maternal thinking and child survival in Brazil. And as the subtitle says, this is 2 decades after the publication of her path-breaking book, Death Without Weeping, which caused enormous discussion, received many awards, and defined in some important new ways a lot of concepts regarding Brazil. In particular, Nancy Scheper-Hughes is, as I think everyone here knows, an exceptional anthropologist who has made some unique contributions to the field. But beyond that, she's also a very highly regarded public intellectual. She's the founder of Organs Watch. She has stimulated public debates globally on a variety of issues related to her work as an anthropologist and other public commentary as well. She's going to speak first, and then we hope to have some time for questions and comments afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Nancy Scheper-Hughes.
Thanks so much, Harley. It's just a pleasure to be here and part of the wonderful Center for Latin American Studies, and to talk about a topic that really shaped my life as an anthropologist. So I'll begin with, it's not every day for an anthropologist that one finds one of one's books and field site, in this case, Timbaúba, the place I call Bom Jesus da Mata, with a little irony because I never thought there was very much of Bom Jesus in this part of the Mata, and the Alto do Cruzeiro, which is identified in the book correctly. There are many Alto do Cruzeiros and many favelas in rural areas and urban areas of Brazil, but it's not often that one finds one's work featured in The Economist as an example of the amazing transformations going on in Brazil's poorest region, the Northeast, or Nordeste. So a new updated edition of Death Without Weeping was already in the works, but The Economist beat me to the punch. The article, which was published last October 2012, opens this way. American anthropologist Nancy Scheper-Hughes carried out field work in Timbaúba, a town in the sugar belt of Pernambuco state in the Brazil's northeast. She described a place seemingly resigned to absolute poverty. The backbreaking task of cutting sugarcane by machete provided ill-paid work for only a few months of the year. The deaths of young children from disease and hunger were accepted without weeping. Traces of that bitter world still survives in Timbaúba today. They sent an Economist reporter to Timbaúba to check it out. In the Alto do Cruzeiro, a poor community on a hillside overlooking the town, Severina da Silva, a maid who also runs a shop in her living room, says that some people still go hungry. She's 48, looks 20 years older. A 31-year-old cane cutter nicknamed Bill, I think he meant Bew, there's a million Bews, it's both a nickname for men and women because Severino and Severina are the 2 favorite names after a local patron saint. So Bill has 6 children, a throwback to the days when people had big families instead of pensions. But today, Bill has a labor contract with full rights. He gets a stipend and a small plot of land from the state government to see him through the idle months. This is part of a broader social safety net provided by democracy in Brazil. It includes non-contributory pensions for rural workers. 6,000 of Timbaúba's poorest residents take part in the Bolsa Familiar, a cash transfer scheme started by Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, hereafter Companheiro Lula, Brazil's president from 2003 to 2010, who was born near Timbaúba. Now that's the end of the quote, and it's a short article. For those who don't know, Lula was actually born in a small town, Caetés, in the Agreste, which is attached to the municipio of Garanhuns. Now, Lula and his legacy is certainly part of the amazing transformation of Timbaúba, which, for me, is a microcosm of broader changes in the Nordeste, but also in Brazil as a whole. What's actually happened, and which The Economist summarizes, is the long-awaited economic miracle that it was announced in the 1980s when the people on the Alto do Cruzeiro used to say, huh, economic miracle. The only miracle we've faced is that we're still alive. But so actually, you know, things have been happening. Enormous economic development. If there's something like the Celtic tiger in Ireland, I don't know what it would be, the something jaguar, you know, in Brazil. So that there's been the construction of a new port in Recife, the development of a sprawling industrial complex. Recife is just a few hours from Timbaúba, and people go back and forth constantly. And this project in Recife has recruited some 40,000 workers. And they're building a huge oil refinery and petrochemical plants for Petrobras. That's the state-controlled oil company. There's a new shipyard, and wind power plants are rising among these tropical coastlands in Recife. And this is all the result of a major commitment of federal funds from former President Lula, and an alliance between the feds and the governor of the state, Eduardo Campos, whose image was you know, on the Economist article. What the article didn't say, and what I knew about Campos, because he occasionally wrote to me, and I couldn't understand why I would be getting emails from his office. What did I know about the governor of Pernambuco? Well, I knew something. I knew briefly his grandfather, Miguel Arraes. Miguel Arraes was a very, very popular governor of the state of Pernambuco until he was deposed by the military in 1964. And so this military, as many of you know, most of you are Latin Americanists, misgoverned, I would like to say, Brazil for 20 years, beginning from 64, and then the abertura begins, the opening around 82, but usually it's 20 years is the way people counted. It was a regime of generals, and the years of the military were actually what shaped Death Without Weeping, and I'll explain why in a little bit. The military dictators called their coup a revolution. That's what we called it in 1964, a revolution, as if insurgent citizens had brought it about. It was also referred to as a bloodless coup. Well, one of the subtexts of Death Without Weeping, which I will make much more clear in the new edition, was to make visible the violence hidden within that bloody suppression of the dangerous urban poor, landless peasants, and rural workers. Structural violence, that we medical anthropologists use that term, could be found in the body counts registered in the Timbaúba Public Registry Office, the Cartório Civil. I've spent more hours there than I'd like to remember. But also the evidence was in the pauper burials of workers who died of treatable diseases, accidents, and women who died in labor and following what were still, and still are for the most part, illegal abortions. And then, of course, in the deaths of infants and babies in the first few years of their lives, which was the primary focus of my book, and its effects on the shaping of maternal emotions and sentiments and practices. Well, the writing of any ethnographic book takes a long time. Hate to say that to graduate students who think they write a dissertation and then they turn it around and they publish it. Well, this particular book took a very long time. It was not 20, although 20 years ago that it was published, but almost 50 years ago, 49 years ago, that I first walked to the top of the Alto do Cruzeiro in Timbaúba with a hammock slung over my shoulder and balancing, there were no wheelies then, a cheap blue plastic suitcase. I was looking for the small hut, a mud hut nestled in a cliff where I was to live with Nailza da Silva, a recent migrant from Mato Grosso. She was part Guarani Indian, and her partner, Zé Antonio, a local itinerant railroad worker. So it was December '64, 4 months after the coup that toppled the left-leaning presidency of João Goulart, amidst front-page headlines in the New York Times warning of peasant insurgency in rural Pernambuco. The U.S. was very much part of that coup. The junta, with U.S. support, was particularly concerned about a movement called the Ligas Camponeses, led by a lawyer from Recife, Francisco Julião. They'd made some headway with peasants and with the local sugarcane cutters who worked on one of a dozen plantations and usinas, really industrialized sugar mills in the region. And many of those were the people that I lived next to in the Alto do Cruzeiro. Well, for me, that day in December 1964 was the beginning of an anthropologist's life's work, somewhere between an obsession, a trauma, and a romance with the shantytown, then home to some 4,000 displaced cane cutters who had just been recently expulsed from the plantations and usinas where they had lived and worked, and who were suddenly let go in anticipation of labor unrest, which fermented by the Ligas, because that's what the government thought or said, and by rural labor unions, many of them attached to the Catholic Church, even then, before liberation theology. So overnight, these people were turned into a proletarianized seasonal contract worker population. They earned roughly $1 a day to cut and to stack cane. Well, that is during the time of the cutting. The rest of the time, they were unemployed and desperate. Immiserated, hungry, prone to mortal disease, from schistosomiasis to malaria to Chagas disease, they were frightened and disoriented. They occupied the Rocky Alto on the periphery of Timbaúba, and they threw together their huts. Most of them at that time used straw. I don't know what to call palha. You know, they made straw huts. And then, of course, they used mud and sticks. And lacking that, lean-tos made of tin, cardboard, and other scrap materials, as in most new invasion communities. They threw together their families in the same boulderized fashion, taking whatever was at hand and making it do. Like at the do-it-yourself French bricoleurs described by Claude Lévi-Strauss in The Savage Mind. Lacking husbands, weekend playfathers would do nicely, as long as they brought home the current youngest babies, Nestle's powdered milk, if not the bacon. Households were temporary, and babies and fathers circulated among the households like slips of credit or perhaps a local lend-lease program. It's a long story. I'm not going to get to the relationship between men and women at this time, but you know, I'll leave a copy of my paper for anyone who wants it. So lacking water, lacking electricity, lacking any sanitation, facing daily food scarcities, epidemics, and police violence, premature death was an everyday occurrence. Former members of the banned peasant leagues told me that their goal was not to overthrow the Brazilian government. Why would they? They liked the government and their president, Goulart. But rather, they were trying to claim the right to a grave of one's own, 6 feet under and a plywood coffin, rather than face the indignity of being shoved into a common grave from a borrowed municipal tin coffin known as the chin chopper, something like the Pinduqueshu. I can't quite remember. That was the extent of the Marxist threat in Pernambuco in 1964. So my assignment from the Pernambucan Health Department was to immunize children, to educate midwives. What did I know? I was 20 years old, right? Attend births in an emergency, treat infections, bind up festering wounds, and visit mothers and newborns at home. I was a visitadora, to monitor their health and refer them as needed to the district health post or to the emergency room of a private hospital owned by the mayor's brother that had a little charity ward which was used for gathering votes from people, not so much for taking care of them. The very first birth And one of the first deaths I witnessed was one in which I was implicated, and that's how I opened Death Without Weeping. I was summoned in the middle of the night to attend the labor of a 16-year-old neighbor on the Alto de Cruzeiro, Lourdes, who deu luz, a wonderful expression for giving birth. She gave birth in her hammock to a scrawny, mottled infant, barely alive, who died a few hours later and was buried in the backyard next to an open pit latrine by the putative father, an older black countryman named Valdemar. Valdemar's face was paralyzed into a menacing grin, revealing his teeth. And initially, I was quite afraid of him. But a more gentle human being I have never encountered since. Vladimir hung himself. A few months later, it's not in Death Without Weeping, but now it's my time to grieve him. A few months later, after Lourdes, his little teenage wife, summarily ended the relationship, blaming him for the infant's misbegotten birth. I don't remember who cut him down, but I do remember the barking puppy at his dangling feet, a stray dog named Laika, after the Sputnik space dog. So perhaps they were Marxists after all. Lourdes went through several relationships after the death of Valdemar, and gave birth to 11 others, only a few of whom survived. So I'm going to just summarize here and then get to the changes, I think, because many of you have read Death Without Weeping and kind of know where I'm coming from. But I wanted to tell about this beginning because it was also shaped the way I do anthropology. Because after I, being a very obedient Peace Corps volunteer attached to the state of Pernambuco Health Department, I did spend several months circling the houses of these miserable huts with a public health medical kit strapped to my shoulder with these pathetic contents they gave me. They gave me a bar of soap, scissors, antiseptics, aspirin, bandages, a glass syringe, several needles, ampoules of vaccine. Often the vaccine was not properly refrigerated, and a pumice stone to sharpen the needles that were used over and over and over again to immunize hundreds of babies. Children ran away when they saw me coming, as well they might. At least 2 little ones reacted violently to smallpox vaccines. One was scarred for life, actually had a kind of a mild case, you might say, of smallpox, probably because so many of the people had skin infections. You had to be very careful in doing anything. Another little tyke was temporarily, thank God, paralyzed by a DPT immunization. Perhaps I had hit a nerve on the baby's buttocks. But what haunted me then, in addition to my own incompetence, was something I didn't have the skill then, or the maturity, or the wits to understand. So I tucked it away. And that question was why the women of the Alto did not grieve the death of their infants and babies. And I was going to read from this little traumatic story. I won't, but if you have Death Without Weeping, it starts on page 270, and it's about a woman who comes to me with a dying baby, which I have to carry all the way down and go all the way to this horrible charity hospital where the baby dies, a very violent death, really, from dehydration and diarrhea and dysentery and so forth. But what was shocking was as I carried this dead baby back, tears coursing down my cheeks, and I think the tears were for me. I was furious that I was going to have to go take this baby and return this baby to a poor mother. And I just thought it was inhumane. But when I got there and they saw, the woman was with many of her women friends and saw me crying, coitada, they said, engraçada, why is she crying? And I said, well, the baby died. And they said, well, it's only a baby. There's more where they come from. So I was just totally shocked by that. And I didn't know what to do with it. And actually, what I did with all of this is that I stopped working with mothers and children at the time, except in political action. I said, away with the vaccines, away with me going and taking babies. We're going to build a creche. And that was, together we decided a place where mothers who are working in the fields, helping their husbands, or working at the river, washing clothes, could leave their babies. And that will lead to another story that I can't go into. This creche and the organization we founded, UPACI, the Union for the People of Alto do Cruzeiro, attracted the attention of the military. If you can imagine, the landowners turned us in, and several members of the association were arrested. I was carted off to, I think it was the 5th Army's battalion or whatever, somewhere outside Recife, which I thought was a joke at the time. I had no idea, that this was a serious business, and was being questioned as to whether or not I was an outside agitator. I said, I'm a good Catholic. I go to communion on Sundays. I'm trying to get babies to live. I don't quite understand what you're talking about. Am I a Marxist? Well, that was the beginning of my becoming a Marxist. Anyway, I was told I had to leave the country, and was saved by Frank Mankiewicz. Frank Mankiewicz, related to the Mankiewicz who was involved in Hollywood, thinking of the Oscars last night, was then headed the Latin America desk. And when he heard the story, he wrote back to the Ministry of Health in Brazil and said, if one of our volunteers is sent home for doing the work she's supposed to do, the whole damn kit and caboodle will go with her. So I was allowed to stay, but what I didn't realize at the time is I was put under house arrest. I didn't know what house arrest was. I was told, you can stay, but you have to report every day your activities to Judge Juiz Geraldo, and you can't meet with any men. You can't meet with more than 4 people behind closed doors. You can't have any meetings, but you can build your bloody creche. Go ahead and do that, because they didn't think mothers were political. And boy, were they wrong about that. But anyway, so what happened was really, I left persona non grata. I could not get back to Brazil. I had to wait until the abertura, till 1982. I went to Ireland. I did research there. I went to Boston, and I did research there. But finally, I got to go back to Brazil. And it was only then, 16 years later, that I went to raise those questions. And these are just some images. That's the largest usina. That's right outside Timbaúba. Pregnant woman who's stacking cane. Bu, who's one of my key informants, comes up often in my writings. And this is an image of a home on the Alto do Cruzeiro. Camp rations. Anyway, so the question I asked is, why did a people who I knew so well to have a richly endowed emotional life, who had multiple words and senses and sensibilities and sense for attachment, love, intimacy, longing, sadness, memory, a lot of which, is wrapped up into that impossible to parse word saudades. They had saudades for everything. And whenever I would go away and I would come back, I knew that sooner or later we'd go out for beer, we'd sit, on the top of the Alto, or we'd sit in a bar downtown, and somebody would say, let's kill those, let's matar os saudades. Let's just talk about things. And it would be events past, memories of walks. Oh, I was in a beach and I saw that. It would be the loss of a parent. It would be the loss of a lover. But it would always be tinged with joy as well as sadness, with love and memory. But they never talked about having saudade for their dead infants. So that was one of the issues. So I think most of you know that what I came away with, without having to go into the deal, let's see if I have something summarized here that might help, that I was really studying what demographers and epidemiologists, not cultural anthropologists, see the life before what's called the demographic transition. And that really means, I'm not saying it's a universal pattern, but it's rather common that facing constant deaths, and the average woman on the Alto do Cruzeiro, average, was across 3 generations, right? And I also went through records that went from the 1960s to the late 1980s. All of the registered deaths of babies I counted. Not all of them were registered. But the average woman had 9.5 pregnancies and ended up with 3 children. 3.5 children, if you do it as an average. So there was a lot of loss. When you're facing something like that, you have to routinize the death, or else you can't stand it. And I could give you many examples. So women had certain attitudes. One of them was the idea that certain infants were just no-goes. They were difícil de criar. Infants that mothers sometimes said, I did reproductive histories with 100 women and then did lots of participant observation. I went to every death that was of a baby, every little makeshift funeral. I mean, really, that was at home, usually on a table. I think one of the memories that was so stark to me was that a little baby who I was particularly attached to, but I could see was on its way out at about the age of 7 or 8 months, and I was trying to coach the mother, you know, with the little bit that I had left of my public health skills of how to make, you know, a kind of ORT, oral rehydration, just with salt and water, and Coca-Cola would do, whatever. Let's just get some liquids into this baby. This baby's not going to make it. The baby dies. Mother is heartbroken, not because the baby died, but because her 2-year-old was having a birthday party the next day. How could you have a funeral and a birthday party? And she said, I already bought the Coca-Cola. I have bought 20 bottles of Coca-Cola. I have a birthday cake. And so I just followed her, and the next day, here she had a little baby in the little cardboard coffin, the birthday cake, and the Coca-Cola bottles, and all the people, you know, kind of looking at the baby, oh, too bad, and then singing the great happy birthday song, Parabéns pra você, which I love, because what it was telling them is, good for you, you little 2-year-old. Good for you, you made it, you survived, you're still here another year, and we're not going to forget about that. And then I remember at the same time, I noticed that there were, the little dead baby had little ants on the face. And one of the neighbors went and just brushed the little ants off the face. And so here it was, birth and death, you know, cheek by jowl. That's what I mean about a pre-demographic transition situation. So mothers thought that infants were not trustworthy. They said things like, babies are like birds. They're flighty, without a secure attachment in this world. Infants are like a flickering candle. Best to assume a posture of distanced, watchful waiting. So they often said that their babies died of doença de criança. This turned out to be a folk euphemism for babies who were seen as born weak, pale, wasted, listless, sometimes prone to violent seizures, and babies that should be let go, even not held to die, but helped to die. A pediatrician in Recife recognized this syndrome, but she said that we call it the criança condenada. That is nothing you can do to make this woman believe that the baby actually can be saved. I prefer to see them as stoics. We often think about, you know, moral thinking today is now a big topic in anthropology, moralities, how they're constituted. I believe these women were practicing a kind of holy indifference, stoical resignation, through the metaphors of their own words, letting go, letting the things be, deixa pra lá, helping the babies when necessary to die easily and to die well, usually by confiscation of liquids. So, acceptable deaths. They died like Jesus, they told me, so that we, their mothers, could live. It was a form of what anthropologists would call sacrificial violence, angel babies as gifts to God. There was also a sense of magical replacement. The idea, as in warfare, when one soldier replaces another, these little soldiers, one after the other. So I remember a woman who had a series of little girls, all that died. Very, very rare, because more boys died than girls. There was a decided preference of the mothers for boys. I mean, for girls. We'd think boys, but not. So after Juliana, the first died, I named all the others Juliana until one decided to stay with me. So the idea was that actually the self is not this, you know, unique constellation, but rather was a role. And the role was Juliana, the beloved child. Okay, so let me see, where am I? So this is an image of a baby that would be destined for this criança condenada. Baby was 2, 3 years old, couldn't stand, walk, or speak. And really, the mother said, it's better that this one is not really. Now, here's what they were saying. It's not that they had a soul, yes. Definitely they had a soul. But they were pre-human. They were pre-human because they were liminal creatures. They were spirit creatures, that they were on their way to another world, and best not to interrupt them on that path. There are different paths. Not every baby born, they'd tell me, was meant to live. They were criatores. I love the word. I think it was very ecologically beautiful. They were creatures of the world. And because of that, they had compassion for them. They often would compare the suffering of an animal with the suffering of a bichinhos, of a little beast. But it wasn't done with any kind of hatred or any, but rather with the way you would treat a beloved creature. And so I was talking about the fact that girls were more favored. Here's an example where this boy is quite malnourished, the little girl is not. So there were selections that were going on. Here's Beatriz with a little boy who I know very well. This one survived because I couldn't bear it, and I just said, give me a Diosan. Give me, this one is not dying. I'm going to take this one. And we get him, pumped up at the hospital. But she was sure her boys didn't like to eat, and she said he was hopeless. He no tem jeito. He didn't have a jeito. He didn't have a talent or a taste for life. But anyway, he lived. Well, he surprised us, she said. But since he was somewhat excluded from the family, I think it contributed to the fact that he became a rather pathetic bandido, and more frequently in jail than anywhere else. And jail for stupid things. I think he didn't have all his juice when he grew up, maybe from having been so starved as a baby. So I will leave all this discussions about why mothers, didn't breast milk, why they didn't breastfeed, long argument. The agents of everyday child death there were not just these poor women who were forced to make choices that no one could make, but clinic doctors who distributed tranquilizers to hungry babies, priests who celebrated and blessed the death of angel babies, the mayor who dispensed free baby coffins but no social assistance or food to hungry families, employers in the cane, but employers also in domestic work, employers who had women do their laundry by the river, who did not allow the women to bring their babies with them to work. So that's what the pre-demographic transition looks like. Ready for death at any age. Okay, I'm going to move on to the future here. Maybe there was one thing here if I was going that there are these interpretive dilemmas. Given the intense intersubjectivity of ethnographic knowledge, what is hidden from view? What are the dangers of making sense of suffering? Was this another version of the culture of poverty? Saying that some poor mothers acquiesced and helped their babies to die does not, in my book, imply blame. Rather, for me, it was a political economy of the emotions, and that's what I entitled one of the chapters, that maternal sentiments were shaped within the material conditions of everyday life. And the question is, where to look for solutions to this problem? Well, I'm going to skip over this. I'll mention it in the end. I went back to Brazil to study street children and to study a death squad that was going after poor children in the employ of some of the landowners of the large sugar plantations, and with the at least passive looking away of the police. So it was against the law for these boys of Timbaúba to be in jail, but I do believe the juiz de menores who said to me, the only way we could keep them from being killed is to put them in the jail. So the police were implicated. Now, what was interesting about this stage, going very quickly, this was after Death Without Weeping. I go back, I'm invited in 2001. I get a fax that was one of the more memorable faxes of my life. I had been going back and forth anyway, but this one came from a judge, a new judge, a woman, Dr. Marisa, and then there was a prosecutor who I'd never heard of, somebody new. They were there placed to get rid of this death squad that I had described earlier in Chapter 6 of Death Without Weeping. They used Chapter 6, never translated into Portuguese, but they had gotten their hands on the Spanish edition, and they translated it, and they turned it into an indictment, And with that indictment, they arrested 11 men and the leader of the death squad, Abidorol Queiroz. But what they didn't know is how many other people were implicated in the death squad and how many victims, because the people were afraid to speak. So one of the things that I found most fascinating during this work was that initially the poor people accepted the death squads as necessary, even when their own sons could be, not that they were, but could be, and some were, targeted. So how to understand this? False consciousness, misrecognition, Bourdieu, a Taussic kind of culture of terror, space of death, Stockholm syndrome, identifying with the oppressor, or internalizing the stigmatizing categories of themselves as rubbish people, marginals, bichos de Africa, street kids, dangerous people from the villas, wasted people, seen as waste, essentially. Well, I think all of those worked together. But what I did find, there was a tipping point. There was a certain point, and I'll just show you, where Jim Holston's insurgent citizenship was really at work. People started organizing, and they said, we won't take this anymore. And they had the recognition, finally, these are two women who had their children killed. Why are so many of the dead black, like us? And so here's mother love and child death. One of the points I was trying to make was that mother love grows gradually, slowly, and intensely, so that the full flowering of mother love is a mother and her adult children. Very unlike the United States, or at least where I grew up. You know, in the 50s, 18, out of the house, go, that's it, you're on your own, take care of yourself. That's not the Brazilian pattern. So, you know, we like to think of Americans as child-centric. We're probably the least child-centered people in the face of the earth. But anyway, so here they are, organizing, going after, saying, we're going to make this public, marching, bringing the siblings of children who had been killed to march, and this was I was marching for Biu's son, Gilvan. Here's Gilvan, who was one of the last of the children that were killed by the squads until they arrested. Okay, well, let me go now to the demographic transition. Let's see how far I can go. All right. What's happened since 1992, you know, all this time of these visits besides death squads and whatever? I think the value of long-term research, multiple returns. I have a field trip, as I said, planned for June, is the ability to engage in a history of the present. Many things have changed since the publication of Death Without Weeping. The people have faced everything that happened in the rest of Brazil, also happened in Timbaúba. A cholera epidemic in 1993 that killed hundreds because of a stupid plan by the State Department of Health that had people not treated in Timbaúba, which at least had a hospital, but to go to some special cholera dispensary near Caruaru that was hours away. They died on the road. With cholera, you die like this. You know, so it just was bad thinking. They faced the HIV/AIDS epidemic because what happened in the meantime is those 11, 12 sugar plantation estates closed down. Impossible. They could not compete with São Paulo. Why? São Paulo could use mechanized cane cutting. On the hills of Northeast Brazil, you couldn't. And they began to say that it was just too much trouble having all these poor people cutting cane and so forth. So that happened. Then this was followed by bitter struggles over illicit international adoptions arranged by foreign brokers from France and the United States who infiltrated communities, not just Timbaúba, but Timbaúba and the Alto Cruzeiro were part of it, from Recife all the way up the sort of coast. And there was a corrupt in Timbaúba, Juiz de Menores, who released infants from mothers who were too poor, too disabled, too confused to give consent. To make matters worse, when an international kidney trafficking cartel settled into the slums of Recife in 2001, until their arrest, with a little help from me, in 2003, the child human rights advocates in Timbaúba, activated by the Constitution and by the Estatuto de Criança y do Adolescente. I must have been given 15 copies of this. They'd walk around with it in their back pocket. They were real human rights workers, and they were organic intellectuals. They were working class people. They were people from the Alto, and they were really out to protect the children, and they created a public lard de criances for kids that had been abused or kids that had been put on the street and so forth. And anyway, what happened is during the period that I was in Recife working on the cartel that was kidney trafficking, is that the human rights activists, who are still my best friends in Timbaúba, came to protest my public declaration in the CPI, which is a congressional investigation, where I said there was no link between the illegal trafficking of babies and the trafficking of adults for their kidneys. And they started protesting and saying, where are our babies? Where are our babies? Where are our babies? So the day that change came along. So they felt betrayed. We're friends again. It's okay. So how I discovered in the midst of doing research on the deaths and mortalities of youth and adolescents, I was playing this cat and mouse game with a woman about as old as me, Amantina, and I guess I've been the bane of her existence. Every time I show up, she knows, oh God, she wants to see the books. And so the books would come out, and I'd sit there for hours after hour after hour, try every single death. I didn't want her to know, when I was there in 2001, that I was studying homicides. Because, you see, some members of the death squad were still active. And I certainly didn't want them knowing that I was messing around with this business. And my husband, Mike, was with me. He was my guardian angel, he said. I said, what are you going to do? You don't have a gun. Now, I don't believe that guns help. But anyway. So Amantina was very surprised, and she kept sort of looking over to me. And she was a woman who had very little affect, very, very much a bureaucrat. And then finally she said, so, what have you found this time? And she had a little smile on her face. And I said, Amantina, I'm actually studying homicides. She said, you're not looking at child mortalities? Why not? And then I said, well, because I'm kind of doing some work for the judge here. Well, don't you want to look at them? Well, rather than weeks and weeks it would take me ordinarily to count infant deaths, I decided to take a look, and all I needed was a single afternoon, because going over the death certificates, the registration, or whatever, because something radical had occurred. A revolution in child survival that began in the 1990s, a little bit later than the norm of urban Brazil, and by this particular year, when I was looking, 2001, recording a completed birth rate, because I looked at births and deaths, roughly 3.2 children per woman, from 9 point what to what, from 3.2, is this right? And Amantina's just smiling at me. And a mortality rate drop of 35 per thousand from, in the 1960s, 110 per thousand births. Incredible. Subsequent field trips in 2006, 2008 showed even further reductions. I finally got one piece of data from the National Statistics Foundation for Timbaúba that recorded in 2009 25 per thousand child deaths. This was a revolution. It was a revolution that took maybe 100 years for the UK or Germany, the United States to do. Was done in a couple of decades. And it was done without coercion. It was done without draconian state-led, like the Indian family planning projects, or like China's one child. It happened voluntarily. And it could not have happened without a radical transformation of their mothers. So Timbaúba experienced what population experts call the epidemiologic transitions. Birth and infant deaths declined so rapidly and precipitously it looked like a reproductive workers' strike. The numbers, though incomplete, were startling. Rather than counting individual deaths, the 300 mortalities that I had in 1965 when I checked it from doing my book in 1960 to the 200 some odd infant child mortalities in the early 80s, by the late 1990s, I was counting in the early 2000s, 38, maybe 40 deaths a year. And each had a clearly defined medical cause of death. None were listed as cause unknown, or simply heart stopped, respiration stopped, or a sort of folkloric, mythopoetic, acute infantile suffering, or none with third-degree malnutrition. So those were the classic causes of death. So I interviewed several women, although I was working on other topics, who were part of the clinic. The woman on the first page of this PowerPoint point was one of the women who is now attending a real clinic. I think my life has also sort of been death without weeping. I had to resign myself to things that I saw. I very rarely cried. I did sometimes. When I literally sat down and wept and sat on a rock on the top of Alto de Cruzeiro was when I saw a beautifully functioning, real clinic taking care of pregnant mothers, and when I met, after all these years, the new visitadores. The new visitadores were men and women recruited from the Alto do Cruzeiro, trained for about $10 each, with their little sacks, going door to door, and doing it with just animation and love and so forth. So I'll just, these are, I don't know how to do on this new machine, it's not very pretty, but I looked up official data. And just to compare, you know, between the 80s and this is World Bank data. Now, I could make a big argument about how incomplete and whatever these statistics are, but it's interesting to compare some countries. Poor Haiti, my God. Look at Cuba, look at the United States, look at Venezuela. You know, you really look at the countries and the dates, and you really can see, even if they're incomplete, even if they're, you know, doctored in different ways. It's quite amazing. So, what allowed women to think differently about their reproductive lives? Well, the women that I interviewed in this clinic, some of them had one, some had two babies. I mean, they're not. By the way, do I have this here? The actual official statistics in Brazil is that over the past decade, Brazil's fertility rate has decreased, this is the nation, from 2.36 children per family to the Brazilian national average. Does anybody know what it is? 1.9. Below replacement and lower than the United States. Now that's a revolution. So we know what's going to happen? IVF. In vitro. Oh, you know, women are way too long. They're going to be running to try to, you know, have artificial births, because this is absolutely amazing. So what the women were saying to me was, we want a casal. We want to have just two kids is perfect. Who needs more than two? Okay, so maybe by accident you have three. But they were confident that the babies they had would be born healthy, would be taken care of. And so they had optimism and hope. And I have to say that that optimism and hope really was, I saw it, ushered in, because I was in Brazil when Lula was being elected. I wasn't there for the actual, you know, counting of the votes or whatever, but when everyone knew. And we were singing on the Alto de Cruzeiro, Ale Lula, Hallelujah. Okay, so what happened is, and it was also Cardoso before him, it wasn't just Lula. Pro-feminist programs, the Bolsa Familiar, free government clinics, rather than getting drugs for patronage from the mayor. There were also free, not everywhere, but in some of the states, including in Pernambuco, there were free contraceptives. Condoms galore, of course, with the AIDS epidemic. But women in Northeast Brazil don't like taking the contraceptive pill. They think it makes them sick, it makes them fat, whatever. You know what Brazilian women want. What do they want? Come on. How are they going to control their birth? They want sterilizations. Absolutely. They always have. So you see, this was a revolution in the making, and it was stopped. It was stopped by the state. Because it's somewhere tucked away, I couldn't find it this morning, a footnote in Death Without Weeping that was kind of like just a little joke. What is it that these poor, desperate people would ask for? Because they, basically we worked together in political, but sometimes they would just come and say, come on, you know people, you can get this for me. So what they asked for, I had a list. Well, they asked for false teeth. They had bad teeth because they had bad dental. They were always sucking on sugar cane, no teeth, okay? They wanted better antibiotics for their children. They always thought they got really bad antibiotics. But most of all, the women pressed on me, please, can you get me ligas, ligas, tubal ligations, okay? That's what they wanted. And their attitude towards, you could say, in the early days, before all these magnificent changes came about in terms of, all the entitlements and benefits. I love the idea that the stipend is called a bolsa. Unless I'm wrong about it, if I compare it, I was an aide to, I was a welfare queen for a few hours of my life. I was a single mother. And so I was on welfare. Welfare has a terrible stigma to it. You can imagine. I mean, it just, you're a welfare, you're getting money for free from the government. Welfare is welfare. But the word bolsa, graduate students get bolsas. I mean, who doesn't want a bolsa? There's no stigma to that. So it was just a brilliant kind of a thing. So I guess I'm wandering a bit, but I think that this, the return, I could show you some image, I think you read all that. Yeah, that the idea about sterilization, they always wanted it. In the old system, the idea was you had to have at least 5 or 6 kids before a doctor would even consider doing it. And you usually had to have money to get it. It was not free. And for the women, that was okay, because they said, you have 5 or 6 kids, and in the end, even then, they just wanted 2. They said, but to get 2, you have to have 6 or 8 pregnancies, because you lose them in infancy, you lose them, to a cholera epidemic. When they're older, you lose them to police squads or death squads, the boys, or your daughter has a botched abortion and she dies that way. So they were good epidemiologists. But now, they want the sterilization after 2. And they'll get it, and they'll get it for free. And they talk about it openly. And the doctors don't mind giving a woman, even as young as 28, if they've had 2 kids and they want to close the factory, that's fine. So I think that was the other thing. Okay, I'm almost 10 minutes. Good, I'm almost done. The other thing is women's reproductive culture is very, very strong. I want to talk a little bit about the role of the Catholic Church, okay? Because there were many, many factors. I sort of talked about, well, what about the Catholic Church? Well, the anomaly is that Brazil, the largest nation in Latin America, population 191 million people, the church still predominates in the public sphere. And abortion is still illegal. The only conditions are to save the life of a mother, or in the case of rape. Family size, nonetheless, has been dropping so sharply over the last few decades that you have to say, well, what's going on here? Well, for one, Brazilian Catholics, Catholicism is different. Irish Catholics are very different from Brazilian Catholics, for example. And Brazilian Catholics are very independent, very much like U.S. Catholics. And they have been going their own way for many, many years when it comes to their health, to their reproductive necessities, and so forth. Others, as we all know, have simply left the church by announcing, becoming evangelical. I think that now it's 60% of Brazil is Catholic, 30% is evangelical, and the rest are either atheist or they're practicing some version of candomblé or spiritism or, whatever. And some of the evangelical churches recruit Catholics by supporting abortion. It's rather almost a little bit cynical. The church itself, no surprise, in Brazil, deeply divided. In 2009, the Archbishop of Recife embarrassed himself totally in demanding that the Vatican excommunicate the doctors and parents of a 9-year-old girl from Recife who was pregnant with twins that were the result of rape by her stepfather. So she'd been raped many times. They said this abuse began when the girl was about 6. The mother did not know this was happening until the little girl at the age of 9 is pregnant. And the girl's tiny stature and her narrow hips put her life in jeopardy. So the doctors actually were not breaking the law against abortion. They said this is a necessity. After comparing the abortion to the Holocaust, Archbishop Cardoso Sobrinho told the media that the Vatican rejects believers who just pick and choose the moral codes that they like. So the Vatican initially approved, and then I understand that it revoked, under protest, the excommunication when they found out that the surgeons had not broken the law and so forth. But the damage was done, and the result was an immediate decline in Recife in church attendance throughout the diocese. On the other hand, what's left of the teachings of liberation theology, which was condemned by the much beloved Pope John II, dislodged a Baroque folk Catholicism that saw God and the saints as authorizing infant deaths of these little angel babies. So during one field trip to Timbaúba, I was asked by Padre Orlando. I didn't name him in the book, and he was very offended. He said, did I ever say something that I wasn't proud of? So I make sure, okay, Padre, no, it's Padre Orlando. He's still there. So Padre Orlando said he absolutely refused to participate in the Baroque custom of blessing the bodies of dead infants as they were being carried to the graveyard. He said, I'm not going to do that anymore. So he asked me and my then graduate student in anthropology, some of you might know her, she's now Professor Cecilia de Mello from Rio, who was visiting me on the Alto, to give an orientation to poor women on birth control in the Casa Paroquial, right there behind the big Baroque church of Nossa Senhora das Dores. When I asked what forms of birth control or contraception I could teach, the good priest replied, I'm a celibate priest, Nancy. How the heck should I know? Teach it all. Teach whatever it is you know. So I reminded him that only the Billings method, the very unlikely and unpredictable rhythm method, was approved by the Vatican. The priest again replied to me, he said, just teach it all, everything you know, and then you can say, but the Pope only approves the not-so-safe rhythm method. And so that's what we did. And the truth was that basically many of the priests were dissidents, and they didn't have to be liberation theologians. They just saw the tragedy of women not having access to contraceptives, and they saw that as leading to this, and I do believe it was a primary cause of the death of infants. So the other thing I was going to say about the independence is it's not just in Timbaúba or in the Northeast, because a colleague of mine, Carol Browner, found this also in Medellin, Colombia, that in many parts, let's say, of parts of South America, I never want to generalize, but I can certainly speak for it in Timbaúba, when I was doing reproductive histories, I got very, very few accounts of abortus. Now, the word aborto means it could be a miscarriage, naturally, or it could be one that you met a medical abortion. They were reporting about 1.5 in my sample abortions. Well, that seemed odd. And here's the oddity of it. Women would often, there's a folk belief, I guess ethnomedical, I don't like the word folk, ethnomedical belief that the most important thing you can do for your reproductive health is what? Have regular menstrual periods. They have to come at the exact time, and and if you miss a period, very quickly you do something about it. And now, for years, women have used different things, from herbal remedies to what they would call pharmaceutical cocktails. They'd go and they'd get, a lot of the things. And then cytotech, am I pronouncing it right? It appears somewhere in the 90s, which is it was at that time when I first was back in Brazil on one of my trips, over the counter. I think now you need a prescription for it, which was like a day after drug. That was never considered, going way back, even when I was doing the early studies, an abortion. That is, you were keeping your menses flowing. And so here's the interesting thing. This is Irmã Christina. She's a German missionary nun, and she keeps this enormous herb garden, and she has a little natural pharmacy store. And among the herbs that she produces are concoctions and syrups and all sorts of things for menstrual regulation, to make sure your menses come. And when I asked Irmã Christina, I said, well, do you think that that's okay? I mean, as a practicing Catholic, she said anything that comes out of God's pharmacy is fine with me. So I'm getting close to the end here. But really, so here's this wonderful community health agent. Now look at one of the things I want to say about the Alto Cruzeiro is it is not an occupation. But it's a working class community today, like any other working class community. Houses have been rebuilt, they're still small, they're very modest, but it's no longer a shanty town. There's paved roads, steps. Everyone except one little side of the Alto has electricity. And boy, does that make a difference. And there is still poverty, you know, but basically this guy, Ruggiero here, he's going to take it down, and if he sees, and we did, I shadowed him for several days, you know, kid or old people. He was also looking after old people. If they looked like there was something wrong, whoop, he'd just take them to the clinic, take them to the hospital as needed. Oh, some people have made a lot of fuss about telenovelas. There's been a couple of articles about it, and I think it's true. You know, the mayor, about 10 years ago, put up a big television in the plaza so that everybody could come down from the mojos and they could sort of watch sports, they could watch football, they could watch the novellas. But now that there's electricity, fans, here's a young girl. She's got not a baby, but a little doll. Another big change. When I first worked on the Alto, little girls were afraid of dolls. They thought they were dead babies. They were horrified, but they couldn't understand why anybody would play with them. So, so basically, I'm ending here with that the people have adopted, the women, a new reproductive strategy. Rather than anticipating deaths, having many babies, hoping that a few survive, replacing those who die by letting them go, that women today expect their infants to thrive and survive. They treat each one as a unique, precious gift, rather than letting go, with holding on, holding close, holding dear. And on top of everything, it really was, you know, this is the materialist in me, it was water that saved those babies. Because people were drinking water that was mixed with river water, they couldn't boil the water or whatever. And so there's now on the top of the 3 Altos. Actually, Timbaúba has 3. There are these big water tanks, and people have water. So street kids are not being killed anymore. They're back on the streets where they belong. This is a carnival. They've got their faces. The mother of little Gilles, you know, Gilvan, who was killed by the death squads, the mother of 11 children, she died, you know, at 56 in 2004. But she was very proud of the fact that sometimes people climbed up the Alto do Cruzeiro with a copy of this book, and they wanted to meet Bew. So she said, "I'm so famosa, so celebrada." I said, you are. People know who you are. So it was sad for her. And unfortunately, you know, she died of tuberculosis that could have been treated and wasn't properly treated. Here's Lourdes, the woman whose baby died at the hands of that man, Valdemar. She finally settled down with a man that was quite much older than herself. He had a pension, and that was a great thing. So she could actually settle down with him. And she almost lost Djalma to cholera. And so here they are playing and remembering when he came home, and she makes his face that he was like this. I thought he still looked like that, but anyway, he lived. And so good things happen. And this is my group of child activists and organic intellectuals who I've been working with really since 1982. And when we get there, we always say, okay, what are we going to work on now? One is a child rights advocate. One was a child rights advocate, tough woman, street kid, who then went to the Peasants' University in Caruaru, that's what it's called, and got herself a legal degree. And there's Sophia and her partner, who's a German nun, and Marcelo Gomez, who's the one, every time he sends me a rare, still they don't have email not very often anyway, he always gives me saudações revolucionários from Marcelo. So we're always trying to make a revolution, and there's a little rainbow over the top of the Alto do Cruzeiro. Oh, one P.S. and I'll end. Okay, I know I've gone beyond my time, but you know, the bottom line is that women in the Alto today don't lose their infants. Okay, that's obvious. Children go to school rather than to work in the cane fields. I'll save it, I guess, whatever it is. And that social cooperatives have sprung up and taken the place of shadow economies. And when they're sick or pregnant or a child is ill, they won't be turned away from cynical private clinics and hospitals. There's a safety net, it's strong, it's large, and it's deep. Now, a few weeks ago, I received a warm letter from a municipal official in Timbuktu who politely declined a generous gift of $5,000 from an American benefactor who wanted to make a difference in terms of health and is part of an NGO that was closing down, and wanted to assist what I described in my book as a small fledgling health clinic on the top of the Alto Cruzeiro. The official, I wrote to him and I said, if I come, I'd like to make this donation. I want to make sure it gets, properly transferred. The official, actually Marcelo Gomes, who's now an assistant to the mayor, replied gently but firmly in Portuguese, but I'll read it in English, "The kind gift will not be necessary because the health post of the Alto de Cruzeiro is in full operation with dentists, obstetricians, nurses, doctors around the clock. It's supported by the National United SUS, by the Universal Unified Health Program, in partnership with the state government. However, this should not prevent you from finding another worthy entity somewhere in the world." Somewhere else in the world. So anyway, that's the revolution.
I have a very brief announcement. Unfortunately, we're about out of time, but Professor Scheper-Hughes has very generously said that she might be able to do an informal discussion one evening at the Center for Latin American Studies about these fascinating findings. If you're not on the Facebook site, we encourage you to go to it because we will post the invitation on the Facebook site of the center. You can get there at clas.berkeley.edu and hit the Facebook icon. Thank you, Nancy.
Sorry I
Thank
went
you all.
on, but I'm happy to